Power is one of the most misunderstood forces in human behavior. Most people imagine power as something loud and obvious: authority, wealth, status, or control over others. They picture powerful individuals as those who dominate conversations, command attention, or sit at the top of visible hierarchies. But the real psychology of power operates far more quietly than that. In fact, the most influential individuals in any environment are often the ones who appear the least desperate to prove their authority. They don't constantly demand recognition, and they rarely feel the need to assert themselves aggressively. Instead, their influence emerges from something deeper: psychological control over their own behavior and a precise understanding of how human perception works. Because power, at its core, is not simply about controlling people. It is about shaping how people think about you. Every social interaction contains an invisible negotiation of perception. People are constantly evaluating signals: confidence, composure, competence, emotional stability, social awareness, and based on those signals, they unconsciously decide who to trust, who to follow, who to challenge, and who to ignore. Most individuals are unaware of how strongly these subconscious evaluations guide their decisions. They believe they are reacting logically, but in reality, their judgments are heavily influenced by subtle cues in body language, tone of voice, emotional reactions, and consistency of behavior. This is why someone with no official authority can sometimes influence an entire room, while someone with a high position struggles to command genuine respect. True power begins with perception, and perception is shaped long before words are spoken. Think about the people you have encountered who naturally command attention when they enter a room. They may not speak immediately, they may not attempt to dominate the space, yet something about their presence creates a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Conversations slow down. People become more attentive. Their words carry weight even when they are few. This phenomenon is not accidental. It is the result of psychological signals that communicate certainty and emotional control. Humans are instinctively drawn toward individuals who appear internally stable. Stability suggests competence, and competence suggests leadership. On the other hand, individuals who constantly seek approval, react impulsively, or over-explain themselves often lose influence without realizing why. Their behavior signals uncertainty, and uncertainty weakens the perception of authority. One of the most powerful psychological principles behind influence is emotional regulation. The ability to remain calm in situations where others react emotionally creates a dramatic shift in social dynamics. When someone raises their voice, becomes defensive, or loses composure, they unintentionally surrender control of the interaction. Their emotional reaction reveals vulnerability, but the individual who remains steady, who listens carefully, responds deliberately, and avoids unnecessary reactions, immediately gains psychological advantage. This does not mean suppressing emotion entirely. It means mastering it. Because when people sense that someone is difficult to provoke, difficult to manipulate, and difficult to destabilize, they begin treating that person differently. They become more cautious, more respectful, and often more curious about what that individual is thinking. Emotional discipline creates an aura of unpredictability, and unpredictability often commands attention. Another critical element of power lies in scarcity. Humans instinctively value what appears limited or difficult to access. This principle applies not only to objects or opportunities, but also to attention and presence. Individuals who constantly seek interaction, constantly share their opinions, and constantly make themselves available often reduce the perceived value of their presence. Familiarity can easily transform into invisibility. But when someone speaks selectively, participates intentionally, and does not feel the need to fill every silence, their words begin to carry greater significance. Silence itself becomes a form of influence. It forces others to lean in, to interpret, to anticipate what might come next. Many of the most strategic communicators throughout history have understood this principle deeply. They recognize that speaking less often increases the impact of what is said. In many situations, the person who speaks last controls the direction of the conversation because everyone else has already revealed their position. This form of patience is rarely practiced by those who crave immediate recognition, yet it is one of the most effective ways to build psychological authority over time. Power is also closely connected to clarity of identity. People who influence others effectively tend to possess a strong internal sense of who they are and what they stand for. Their decisions appear consistent because they are guided by stable values rather than momentary pressure. This consistency creates trust. Humans feel more comfortable following individuals whose behavior is predictable in principle, even if it is unpredictable in strategy. When someone demonstrates that they cannot be easily pushed away from their values, their presence begins to carry weight beyond the immediate situation. Others recognize that this person is not simply reacting to circumstances, they are operating from a deeper internal framework. This type of identity-driven behavior is one of the most reliable sources of long-term influence. It transforms authority from something temporary into something that feels rooted in character. and character is difficult to challenge directly. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of power is how often it exists without being recognized by the person who possesses it. Many individuals unknowingly weaken their influence by constantly trying to prove their value. They overcompensate with excessive explanations, constant visibility, or relentless effort to be liked by everyone around them. But the paradox of power is that the more desperately someone tries to display it, the less authentic it appears. True influence rarely needs to announce itself. It reveals itself gradually through behavior, through calm confidence, emotional discipline, thoughtful communication, and the ability to remain unaffected by unnecessary conflict. And once people begin noticing these qualities, something interesting happens. Their perception shifts. The same individual who once seemed quiet or reserved now appears deliberate and strategic. Their silence seems thoughtful rather than uncertain. Their restraint seems powerful rather than passive. In other words, their influence begins to grow without them needing to force it. This is the hidden foundation of power and influence, the ability to shape perception through controlled behavior rather than loud authority. And once someone begins to understand these psychological mechanisms, they start seeing social dynamics very differently. Because power is rarely found where people expect it. It is not always in the loudest voice or the most visible position. More often, it resides in the individuals who understand human psychology deeply enough to move quietly within it. Once you begin to understand that power is deeply connected to perception, another layer of influence starts to reveal itself: the psychology of attention. Because attention is one of the most valuable currencies in any social environment. Every conversation, every meeting, every group interaction is essentially a competition for attention. People may not consciously realize it, but they are constantly measuring whose words hold the room, whose ideas guide the direction of discussion, and whose reactions shape the emotional tone of the moment. Those who understand this dynamic learn something critical: controlling attention is often more powerful than controlling people directly. When you influence where people focus their thoughts, you indirectly influence the decisions they make afterward. Consider how conversations unfold in groups. Often, one person introduces a topic, another adds an opinion, and soon the discussion expands into multiple directions. But occasionally, someone enters the conversation and quietly redirects the entire focus. They might ask a simple question that reframes the issue, or they might highlight a perspective that no one else considered. Suddenly, the conversation reorganizes itself around that new idea. The individual who introduced it may not appear dominant, but they have effectively guided the collective attention of the group. This subtle redirection is one of the most overlooked forms of influence. The ability to guide conversations without appearing controlling allows someone to shape outcomes while maintaining the image of neutrality. Another powerful psychological mechanism behind influence is strategic listening. Most people believe influence comes primarily from speaking persuasively. But in reality, those who listen carefully often gain the greatest advantage. When you listen more than you speak, people reveal information about their priorities, insecurities, motivations, and expectations. These details become invaluable in understanding how they make decisions. A skilled observer learns to recognize patterns in what others emphasize repeatedly. What topics excite them? What topics make them uncomfortable? What triggers defensiveness? All of these signals provide insight into the internal frameworks that guide their behavior. Once you understand those frameworks, influencing them becomes significantly easier, because people rarely resist ideas that appear aligned with their existing beliefs. Instead of confronting their perspective directly, effective influencers subtly connect new ideas to what the other person already values. The result feels natural rather than forced. The other person believes they arrived at the conclusion independently, even though the direction of the conversation was carefully guided. This is why strategic listening often produces far more influence than aggressive persuasion. Another dimension of power emerges through emotional contrast. Human perception is highly sensitive to differences in emotional energy within a group. When most people react impulsively, the individual who remains calm appears more credible. When most people compete for attention, the person who speaks thoughtfully appears more intelligent. When most people rush to express opinions, the person who pauses and analyzes appears more insightful. In other words, influence often grows from behaving differently than the dominant emotional pattern in the environment. This does not require dramatic gestures. Sometimes it is simply a matter of slowing down while others rush, asking questions while others argue, or maintaining composure while others become reactive. These small contrasts gradually shape how people perceive authority within the group. Over time, individuals begin associating calmness with competence and thoughtfulness with leadership. And once that association forms, the person who embodies those traits gains influence without needing to demand it. There is also an important psychological rule that governs how influence spreads within social networks. People trust signals from behavior more than signals from words. Someone may describe themselves as confident, intelligent, or capable, but those descriptions carry little weight unless they are consistently reflected in behavior. Humans are highly skilled at detecting inconsistencies between what someone claims and how they actually behave. Even subtle contradictions can weaken credibility. On the other hand, When behavior consistently aligns with the image someone projects, trust begins to accumulate naturally. This is why reputation plays such a powerful role in influence. Reputation is essentially the memory of consistent behavior stored in the minds of others. Each interaction contributes a small piece to that memory. Over time, those pieces combine to form a stable perception of who you are. Individuals who understand the psychology of influence treat every interaction as an opportunity to reinforce their identity. They remain consistent in their communication style, their emotional responses, and their decision-making principles. That consistency becomes the foundation of long-term authority. Because once people believe they understand how you think and operate, they begin predicting your reactions before you even speak. And when your predicted reaction carries weight, influence becomes automatic. Another important element of influence is the management of uncertainty. Humans are naturally uncomfortable with ambiguity. When people feel uncertain about a situation, they instinctively look for signals that help them interpret what is happening. In these moments, the individual who appears most composed often becomes the reference point for the group. Others watch their reactions carefully, using them as cues for how to respond themselves. This is why leaders in high-pressure situations are expected to maintain calm. Their emotional stability becomes a signal that the situation is manageable. Even when uncertainty remains, the appearance of confidence can prevent panic and maintain group cohesion. But this principle extends far beyond in everyday environments, workplaces, social circles, negotiations. The person who remains steady when others feel uncertain often becomes the informal authority within the group. People begin seeking their opinion more frequently. Their approval carries more weight, their silence becomes meaningful, and gradually, their presence begins shaping the direction of decisions around them. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of influence is that it often works best when it remains invisible. Direct attempts to control others usually trigger resistance. Humans instinctively protect their sense of autonomy. When someone feels manipulated or pressured, they push back, even if the idea being presented is reasonable. But subtle influence avoids this reaction entirely. Instead of forcing outcomes, it gently guides perception and attention in ways that feel natural to everyone involved. The result is cooperation rather than resistance. And this quiet cooperation is the true hallmark of effective influence. Because when people believe they are acting voluntarily, their commitment to the decision becomes stronger. Understanding these psychological principles changes the way you observe social interactions. Conversations begin to reveal hidden structures of influence. You start noticing who guides attention, who remains emotionally steady, who listens carefully before speaking, and who subtly frames ideas in ways that shape group thinking. These individuals may not always hold official authority, yet their presence quietly directs the flow of decisions around them. And recognizing this dynamic is the next step toward understanding how influence truly operates beneath the surface of everyday human behavior. As you begin to understand how attention and perception shape influence, another deeper layer of power becomes visible, the psychology of positioning. Because influence is not only about what you say or how you behave in the moment, it is also about where you place yourself within the invisible structures of a social environment. Every group, whether it is a workplace, a community, or a social circle, naturally develops a hierarchy of influence. This hierarchy is rarely written down, yet everyone senses it. Certain individuals become the reference points for ideas, decisions, and emotional tone. Others remain on the edges, participating but rarely shaping outcomes. What determines who occupies these positions is not always competence alone. It is the ability to manage how others interpret your presence over time. One of the most powerful positioning strategies is selective visibility. Most people believe influence requires constant activity, constantly speaking, constantly contributing, constantly demonstrating value. But this approach often has the opposite effect. When someone tries to prove their importance in every situation, their contributions begin to blend into the background. Familiarity reduces perceived significance. On the other hand, individuals who choose their moments carefully create contrast. When they speak, people notice. When they contribute an idea, it stands out because it was not preceded by constant commentary. This selective engagement builds anticipation around their participation. Others begin expecting that when this person does speak, it will matter. Over time, their presence becomes associated with meaningful input rather than constant noise. This simple shift in positioning dramatically increases the perceived weight of their influence. Another powerful aspect of positioning is the management of alliances. Humans rarely operate entirely as individuals within social environments. Instead, they form networks of trust and cooperation. These networks influence whose opinions gain support and whose ideas struggle to gain traction. Individuals who understand the psychology of power recognize that relationships themselves can amplify or weaken influence. But the most effective alliances are rarely loud or performative. They are quiet, consistent connections built on mutual respect and shared understanding. These relationships create invisible support systems within a group. When someone proposes an idea, their allies naturally reinforce it through agreement or thoughtful expansion. This reinforcement creates the impression that the idea already has momentum, and momentum strongly affects how groups evaluate proposals. Humans tend to trust ideas that appear to have existing support. In this way, influence can spread through networks of subtle cooperation rather than through forceful persuasion. However, alliances require careful balance. If they become too obvious, they can trigger suspicion or resistance from others in the group. The most effective alliances operate through natural interaction rather than visible coordination. Another psychological dimension of power involves controlling reactions rather than actions. Most people believe influence comes from what they actively do, speaking, directing, persuading, but often the most powerful move in a social dynamic is restraint. When someone expects a reaction and does not receive it, the psychological balance shifts immediately. Imagine a situation where someone attempts to challenge or provoke you publicly. They may expect defensiveness, argument, or emotional reaction, but when the response is calm observation or thoughtful redirection, their strategy loses momentum. Instead of gaining attention, their challenge begins to appear unnecessary or even inappropriate. This form of restraint requires emotional discipline, but it can dramatically change how a group interprets the interaction. The person who remains composed appears more credible, while the person pushing for conflict often appears less stable. Over time, consistent emotional restraint builds a reputation for psychological strength. People begin recognizing that attempts to destabilize you rarely succeed. This reputation alone discourages many forms of subtle social competition. Another important component of influence is narrative control. Humans naturally organize experiences into stories. They interpret events by connecting actions, motivations, and outcomes into coherent explanations. Whoever shapes that narrative often shapes how others understand reality within the group. This does not mean inventing stories or manipulating facts. It means framing events in ways that emphasize certain interpretations over others. For example, when a mistake occurs, it can be described as failure or as part of a learning process. When a disagreement appears, it can be framed as conflict or as constructive debate. The facts remain the same, but the interpretation changes how people emotionally respond to the situation. Skilled influencers understand this dynamic deeply. They guide the narrative by choosing language that directs attention toward stability, progress, and purpose rather than chaos or blame. Because once people adopt a particular narrative, their future decisions tend to align with it automatically. This subtle shaping of interpretation can have long-lasting effects on group perception and trust. There is also a paradox within the psychology of power that many people overlook. Influence increases when you appear independent of needing it. Individuals who constantly seek approval, recognition, or validation signal that their confidence depends on external acceptance. This dependence weakens their authority because others sense that their position is negotiable. But individuals who remain consistent in their values regardless of temporary approval create a different impression entirely. Their identity appears stable. They seem guided by principles rather than popularity. And this perceived independence makes their perspective more compelling. People often trust those who appear capable of standing alone if necessary. This does not mean rejecting cooperation or isolating yourself. It simply means that your behavior does not change dramatically depending on who approves or disapproves in the moment. Over time, this steadiness creates a powerful reputation. Others begin viewing your perspective as reliable even when they disagree with it. And reliability is one of the most valuable qualities in building long-term influence. Ultimately, the psychology of positioning reveals something profound about how power truly develops. It is not built through a single dramatic action or moment of authority. Instead, it emerges gradually from consistent patterns of behavior, selective visibility, quiet alliances, emotional restraint, narrative framing, and independence of identity. Each of these elements strengthens perception in subtle ways. And perception, once established, begins shaping how others interpret everything you do afterward. Because when people believe someone possesses influence, they start responding to that person differently even before any words are spoken. That shift in expectation is where power quietly begins to solidify within the structure of a group. As influence begins to solidify through positioning, alliances, and perception, another deeper dimension of power emerges: the psychology of restraint and strategic patience. Most people assume power comes from constant action, from always moving first, speaking first, deciding first. But the individuals who truly understand influence often practice the opposite approach. They recognize that timing is one of the most powerful forces in human interaction. Acting too quickly can expose intentions before others reveal theirs. Speaking too soon can limit your ability to observe how people think and react. Strategic patience, on the other hand, creates information advantages. When you allow situations to unfold before intervening, people naturally reveal their priorities, their fears, and their hidden motivations. Every discussion becomes a source of data. Every reaction becomes a signal. Those who rush to control the moment often miss these signals entirely because they are too focused on asserting themselves. But the patient observer learns how individuals behave under pressure, how they react to disagreement, and how they adjust when circumstances change. This knowledge becomes a powerful asset, because once you understand how people think, influencing their decisions becomes far easier than trying to force them through authority alone. Another key element of power lies in managing visibility during conflict. Human environments inevitably produce disagreement and competition. Opinions clash, interests diverge, and individuals attempt to assert their perspective. In these moments, the way someone handles conflict reveals more about their influence than any speech or presentation ever could. Those who react impulsively often damage their credibility. Emotional responses may feel justified in the moment, but they create the impression that the person can be destabilized. And once people sense that someone can be emotionally triggered, they may intentionally or unintentionally use that vulnerability again in future interactions. But when someone approaches conflict with controlled clarity, addressing the issue without escalating emotion, they demonstrate psychological authority. They show that disagreement does not threaten their stability. This composure shifts how others interpret the situation. Instead of focusing on the conflict itself, people begin paying attention to the contrast in behavior between those involved. Over time, the individual who consistently maintains composure becomes associated with rational leadership, while the one who reacts impulsively appears less trustworthy. Power quietly accumulates through this contrast. Another fascinating aspect of influence is the role of ambiguity. Most individuals feel uncomfortable when they cannot immediately interpret someone's intentions. They prefer clear signals that explain what a person thinks or plans to do next. But individuals who understand influence often use a measured level of ambiguity strategically. They do not reveal every thought or reaction instantly. They allow small spaces of uncertainty to exist in their communication. This does not mean being dishonest or manipulative. It simply means maintaining a degree of psychological distance that prevents others from predicting every move. This unpredictability increases curiosity. People begin paying closer attention because they are unsure what to expect. And attention, as we know, is one of the central currencies of influence. When individuals cannot easily categorize someone's intentions, they tend to observe that person more carefully. Over time, this careful observation strengthens the perception that the individual possesses deeper insight or strategy. Another powerful psychological factor behind influence is emotional independence. Humans naturally mirror the emotional states of those around them. When a group becomes anxious, individuals often absorb that anxiety. When excitement spreads, enthusiasm multiplies quickly. But individuals who maintain emotional independence resist this automatic mirroring. They observe the emotional climate without allowing it to control their own reactions. This ability creates a stabilizing effect in social environments. Others begin looking to that individual as a reference point during moments of uncertainty. If tension rises and one person remains calm, their presence gradually anchors the emotional tone of the group. This does not require commanding authority or issuing instructions. The stability itself becomes influential. People begin aligning their reactions with the person who appears most grounded. Over time, this quiet emotional leadership becomes one of the most reliable forms of power. It operates beneath the surface, shaping how people interpret situations before decisions are even made. There is also a subtle but powerful principle within the psychology of influence, known as controlled generosity. Many individuals believe that giving freely, sharing ideas, support, or opportunities will naturally increase their influence, and generosity can indeed build trust. But when generosity becomes constant and unlimited, it often reduces perceived value. Humans instinctively associate value with effort and rarity. If something is always available without effort, it gradually becomes expected rather than appreciated. Controlled generosity balances these forces. The individual offers help, insight, or opportunities selectively, at moments when it carries the greatest impact. This creates a pattern where their contributions feel meaningful rather than routine. People begin associating their involvement with progress or solutions. This association strengthens the perception that their presence improves outcomes, and once that perception forms, their influence extends beyond individual interactions. They become someone others naturally seek when facing uncertainty or complex decisions. Perhaps the most interesting transformation in the psychology of power occurs when someone stops trying to dominate situations entirely. Instead of controlling every outcome, they focus on shaping the environment in which decisions occur. They guide conversations toward productive questions, encourage thoughtful perspectives, and reduce unnecessary emotional escalation. In doing so, they influence the structure of discussion itself. And when the structure changes, the results often follow naturally. This indirect approach to influence is far more sustainable than constant direct control. People rarely resist environments that allow them to feel respected and heard, but those environments can still be guided quietly toward specific directions by someone who understands human behavior deeply. At this stage, influence becomes less about individual actions and more about long-term presence. Others begin recognizing patterns of stability, fairness, and insight. Trust accumulates gradually, and with that trust comes authority that does not need to be announced. decisions start gravitating toward the person who consistently demonstrates thoughtful judgment, and this is where power reaches a new level of subtlety. Because by the time people consciously recognize that someone holds influence, that influence has often been shaping their thinking for a long time already. As all these layers of perception, positioning, patience, and emotional control begin to come together, the psychology of power reveals its final and perhaps most important truth. Real influence is rarely loud, and it is almost never desperate. The individuals who hold the strongest psychological authority are not constantly trying to prove that they are powerful. In fact, they often appear surprisingly ordinary on the surface. They do not chase attention, they do not argue endlessly to defend their opinions, and they do not measure their value through constant recognition from others. Instead, their influence grows from a deeper place, a stable internal framework that guides their behavior regardless of the situation. Because the moment someone becomes dependent on approval, their power becomes fragile. If their confidence rises and falls with every compliment or criticism, then others can easily control their emotional state. But when someone develops a strong internal compass, a clear sense of values, boundaries, and identity, their behavior becomes far less reactive. They stop adjusting themselves constantly to match the expectations of every person in the room. And this steadiness creates something rare in social environments: predictability of character. People may not always agree with them, but they begin to trust that their actions come from consistent principles rather than momentary emotion. And trust is one of the most powerful foundations of influence. Over time, those who consistently demonstrate psychological stability become reference points within their environments. When confusion appears, people look toward them for clarity. When tension rises, people observe how they respond before deciding how to react themselves. This does not happen because the individual demanded authority. It happens because others gradually recognize a pattern of calm thinking, emotional discipline, and thoughtful decision-making. And once that pattern becomes clear, their presence alone begins shaping the atmosphere of discussions and decisions. Perhaps the most interesting shift occurs when someone fully understands that influence is not about controlling people, but about controlling themselves. Most individuals spend their energy trying to manage the behavior of others, convincing them, correcting them, persuading them. But this approach often creates resistance because humans instinctively defend their independence. The moment people feel pushed, they push back. But the individual who focuses on self-mastery instead of control over others operates on an entirely different level. They refine their own communication, their emotional responses, their patience, and their ability to observe before acting. And as this self-mastery develops, something remarkable happens. Their influence becomes natural rather than forced. People begin respecting their perspective because it consistently produces thoughtful outcomes. Their words carry weight not because they are louder, but because they are measured. Their silence becomes meaningful because it signals careful reflection rather than hesitation. Over time, their presence begins affecting how others behave around them. Conversations become more focused, emotional reactions become more restrained. People begin choosing their words more carefully. This subtle shift is the true indicator that influence has taken root. It changes the environment without the need for direct commands. Another key realization at this stage is that power is sustainable only when it remains connected to responsibility. History repeatedly shows that influence used purely for ego eventually collapses. When someone begins using their authority to dominate or manipulate others for personal gain, trust erodes quickly. And without trust, influence becomes fragile and temporary. But when influence is used to create stability, fairness, and thoughtful decision-making, it strengthens over time. People begin associating that individual with reliability and clarity. They feel more comfortable sharing ideas, asking questions, and participating openly in discussions. In this way, influence becomes not only a personal advantage, but also a stabilizing force for the group itself. The most respected individuals in any environment often share this quality. Their authority does not create fear, it creates structure. Others feel that situations become clearer and more manageable when they are involved. This is why the most effective leaders rarely appear obsessed with power itself. They are focused on understanding people, understanding situations, and maintaining the discipline necessary to respond wisely rather than impulsively. And this brings us to the final psychological insight behind power and influence. The less someone needs to prove their authority, the more naturally it is recognized by others. When someone is comfortable with silence, comfortable with disagreement, and comfortable with allowing ideas to unfold without immediate control, they demonstrate a level of confidence that cannot easily be imitated. That confidence communicates something powerful to everyone around them, that their identity does not depend on dominating the moment. And paradoxically, this independence often makes others more willing to follow their direction when it truly matters, because people trust those who appear capable of standing alone. Once you begin understanding these dynamics, the way you see social interactions will never be quite the same again. You will start noticing who truly controls the emotional tone of a room, who guides conversations quietly, who observes more than they react, and who remains steady when pressure rises. These are the individuals whose influence grows gradually but powerfully over time. And the fascinating part is that this kind of influence is not reserved for a special group of people. It is a skill that can be developed by anyone willing to practice self-awareness, emotional discipline, and careful observation of human behavior. The psychology of power is not about becoming manipulative or controlling. It is about becoming conscious of the invisible forces that shape every interaction around us. And once you understand those forces, you gain the ability to move through social environments with far greater clarity and intention. Now I'm curious about something. When you think about the environments you are part of, your workplace, your social circle, the conversations you experience every day, who do you notice holding the real influence? Is it the loudest voice, or is it the person who seems calm, observant, and difficult to destabilize? Share your thoughts in the comments because these observations reveal a lot about how power actually operates in the real world. And if this discussion helped you see human behavior from a deeper psychological perspective, consider subscribing and staying connected, because the next conversation might reveal another hidden dynamic that changes how you understand influence, power, and the psychology behind the decisions people make every day.